Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be looking at ISO 31000.
Okay.
And I know, we always say this, but this one is really interesting and really relevant, I think, for compliance officers.
It is.
Um, on the surface, it might seem like just another, standard to keep track of another framework,
Right.
but it's really got some interesting stuff in it.
Yeah. And what I think is most interesting about it is it's not just about avoiding risk.
Yeah.
It's about how to use risk to meet your objective.
Right. And that was one of the things that really struck me when I was reading through the material was this focus on context.
Yeah.
It's not just, here's a list of things you need to do to manage risk. It's like, well, wait a minute.
Right.
What kind of organization are we talking about?
Exactly.
What industry are you in?
Yeah.
What are your specific, goals and all that?
Yeah. And that's so important for compliance officers because
Oh, totally.
a context that they're working in is so specific.
Yeah.
And it's constantly changing.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can't just have a generic approach.
Yeah, you can't just pull some, dusty binder off the shelf and say, okay, here's the risk management plan.
Totally.
You got to really tailor it.
Yeah, and that's why I think this is so relevant to compliance officers because, compliance by its very nature is a risky
Oh, absolutely.
undertaking, right? I mean, you're dealing with regulations, you're dealing with stakeholders, you're dealing with all these potential pitfalls.
Totally.
So having a structured approach to managing those risks,
Yeah.
I think is essential.
So when we talk about risk in this context, what are some of the things that a compliance officer should be thinking about? Or what should they be looking for?
Well, it really depends on the industry and the size of the organization.
Right.
But some of the common ones, data privacy breaches.
Oh, yeah. Big one.
Anti-bribery violations,
Mhm.
Regulatory changes that could catch you off guard,
Yeah.
supply chain disruptions. I mean, there's a whole
A long list.
laundry list.
So, okay, let's say you've identified some of these risks you've gone through. And you said, okay, these are the things that could potentially trip us up.
All right.
What's the next step? What do you do then?
Well, you don't just start scrambling to fix everything.
Right.
You have to actually analyze those risks.
Okay.
How likely are they to occur? And if they did occur, what would be the impact?
Okay.
So that helps you prioritize which risks need your immediate attention
I see.
and which ones maybe you can put on the back burner for now.
So it's about being strategic, not just reactive, not just putting out fires all the time, but really thinking ahead.
Right. And thinking about, okay, if this were to happen, what would be the consequences and how can we either prevent it from happening
Right.
or minimize the damage if it does happen?
Okay, so you've identified the risks, you've analyzed them, then what?
Then you get into the treatment phase,
Okay,
which is really about deciding how you're going to handle each risk.
gotcha.
So you've got a few options.
Mm-hmm.
You can try to mitigate the risk by implementing stronger controls.
I don't know, stronger passwords? Or...
Yeah, or better training for your employees.
Okay.
You could transfer the risk,
Okay.
through insurance, for example.
Right.
You could avoid the risk altogether
Okay.
by changing a process or maybe not engaging in a particular activity.
Interesting.
Or you could just accept the risk
Yeah, okay.
if the cost of addressing it is greater than the potential benefit.
So it's really about making those decisions and weighing the pros and cons.
Exactly.
And figuring out, what's the best approach for our particular organization.
Exactly. And I think that's where it starts to get really interesting for compliance officers because it's not just about following the rules.
Right.
It's about making strategic choices
Yeah.
that can actually benefit the company.
It gives you that agency. It gives you that power to say,
Exactly.
hey, we're not just going to blindly do this because the rule book says that. So we're going to actually analyze this and figure out what makes sense.
Right. And make a case for why you're doing what you're doing
I like that.
based on evidence and data.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about identifying, analyzing, treating risks, but how do you actually implement all of this? I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of moving parts here.
Yeah, it's not a simple process.
Right.
But I think the key is to start with leadership buy-in.
Okay.
You need to get the executives on board with this idea of building a culture of risk awareness.
Because if they're not on board, then
It's going to be an uphill battle.
it's going to be really tough.
So you need them to champion it.
Yeah.
You need them to communicate it to the rest of the organization.
And then once you have that buy-in, how do you actually make it happen?
Well, communication is key.
Okay.
You need to make sure that everyone in the organization understands their role in managing risk.
Okay.
It can't just be the compliance department's responsibility.
Right. It's got to be everybody
It has to be everyone.
from the top down.
Yeah, and it has to be integrated into everything you do.
So it becomes part of the fabric of the organization.
Exactly. It's not just an extra task on someone's to-do list.
Yeah, it's how we do things around here.
Exactly.
That's the way we roll.
And I think that's the key to making it sustainable.
And how do you get people to buy into that? I mean, for some companies, that might be a big shift.
It can be.
To go from, we just do what the rule book says, to now we're going to actually think about risk in everything we do.
Right.
How do you get people on board with that?
Well, I think you have to highlight the benefits.
Good.
ISO 31000 is not just about avoiding problems. It's about creating opportunities.
Okay.
It can help companies make better decisions. It can help them improve efficiency. It can even help them gain a competitive advantage.
So it's about turning risk from a threat into an asset.
Exactly. It's about turning a O into what if.
I like that.
And using those what ifs to drive innovation and success.
What if we could do this better?
Exactly.
What if we could, be more efficient? What if we could actually, use this to our advantage? And I think that's a really powerful reframing.
It is.
Because it takes something that people often see as negative, risk.
Right.
And it turns it into something positive.
Exactly.
Something that can actually help you grow and improve.
And that's a much more empowering way to think about it.
I like that.
Instead of just being afraid of risk,
Right.
you're actually embracing it.
Yeah, and using it to your advantage.
Yeah.
I like it.
And I think that's a key part of what ISO 31000 is all about.
That's cool. And I think, one of the things that I've seen people struggle with is this idea of, how do I actually put this into practice?
Right.
Like, how do I take this framework and actually make it work in my organization?
Yeah.
And I think
it can be daunting.
it can be really daunting because it's like, okay, this is a whole new way of thinking.
Right.
It's a whole new way of approaching things.
Yeah. And it's not something you can just flip a switch and suddenly you're doing it.
Right.
It takes time.
Yeah.
It takes effort. And it takes a willingness to change.
To really commit to it.
Exactly.
And to see it through.
And I think the best way to approach it is to start small.
Oh,
Don't
sure.
try to do everything at once.
Yeah.
Focus on a specific area or department.
Like maybe your own team?
Yeah, exactly.
As a compliance officer, start with your own team.
Implement the principles.
Yeah.
Implement the process.
Yeah.
Learn from your experience.
Yeah.
And then gradually expand your efforts.
So it's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly.
You don't just arrive at ISO 31000 compliance.
Right.
You're constantly working on it.
It's a continuous improvement process.
And I think that's something that's really important to remember because it can feel overwhelming.
It can.
If you think about like, oh my gosh, we have to do all of this all at once.
Right.
But if you break it down into smaller steps
Yeah.
and you focus on one thing at a time,
Right.
it becomes much more manageable.
Exactly.
And I think it also makes it more likely that you'll actually succeed because you're not trying to bite off more than you can chew.
Right.
You're taking it one step at a time.
And you're building momentum as you go.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's really important.
I like that.
All right.
All right, so I think we've laid a pretty good foundation here
Yeah.
for understanding what ISO 31000 is all about
I think so.
and why it's so relevant for compliance officers.
Definitely.
So in the next part of our deep dive,
Yep.
we're going to dig a little deeper into some of the specific components of the standard.
Okay.
And we'll talk about some practical tips for actually implementing it in your organization.
Sounds good.
So stay tuned.
All right. And, when you start thinking that way, it really changes how you approach risk.
Yeah, it's not just this thing to be feared.
Right.
It's like, okay,
It's something you can actually use.
yeah, how can we use this to make things better?
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the nuts and bolts of ISO 31000. The source material talks about, these core components. You've got the principles, you've got the framework, and you've got the process.
Right.
Can you kind of break those down for us a little bit?
Yeah, so think of it this way. The principles are kind of like the guiding philosophy.
Okay.
The framework is the structure,
Okay.
and the process is the step-by-step guide.
Gotcha. Okay, so principles first.
Okay.
What do we talk about there?
Well, one of the key principles is that risk management should be integrated into everything you do.
Yeah.
It's not a separate function. It's part of decision-making at every level.
So it's not just the compliance officer's job.
Exactly.
It's everybody's job.
Everybody has to have that risk lens.
Okay, I like that.
So, for example, you've got a sales team.
Right.
They're eager to close deals.
Sure.
But are they considering the potential risks of onboarding a new client?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
Maybe there are some red flags there in
Yes.
terms of their financial history or their regulatory compliance.
You don't want to get caught up in something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So ISO 31000 encourages them to incorporate a risk assessment into their process
So they're thinking about it from the get-go.
from the beginning.
Okay, integrated risk management. That's one principle. What else?
Another big one is tailoring your approach to the organization's context,
Right, we talked about that earlier.
which we talked about earlier.
It's not one size fits all.
No, two organizations are the same.
Gotcha.
Another principle is about involving stakeholders.
Okay.
So that means getting input from employees at all levels,
Okay.
as well as external parties like regulators, customers, suppliers.
So you're getting a 360-degree view
Exactly.
of the risk.
You need to understand the risks from different perspectives.
And I imagine that also helps with buy-in
Absolutely.
when people feel like they're part of the process.
They're more likely to support it.
Okay, what else?
Another principle is about being dynamic and responsive to change.
Okay.
So, the business world is constantly changing.
Yeah.
So your risk management approach needs to be adaptable.
It can't be static.
It can't be a dusty binder on a shelf.
Right, it's got to be a living document.
It's a living document.
Okay, so principles check. What about the framework? How does that fit in?
So the framework provides the structure to support all of this.
Okay.
So it outlines things like leadership commitment, clear communication channels, resources dedicated to risk management.
So it's about setting the stage for success.
Exactly.
Making sure that you have the right infrastructure in place
To make it all work.
to actually make it happen.
Yeah.
Okay, and then finally the process.
Right.
What's that all about?
So the process outlines the specific steps you take to manage risk.
Okay.
So from identifying potential issues to analyzing their impact to deciding how to treat them.
So this is where the rubber meets the road.
Exactly.
It's where you actually put those principles and that framework into action.
You're not just talking about risk, you're actually managing it.
Yeah. You're doing something about it.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm looking at some of the sources that our listeners sent in,
Okay.
and they're talking about some pretty compelling benefits of ISO 31000.
Yeah.
Increased stakeholder confidence, better decision-making, even a boost to your career.
Right.
Let's explore those a little bit.
Sure.
Let's start with stakeholder confidence. How does ISO 31000 help with that?
Well, when regulators see that you have a robust risk management framework that's based on an internationally recognized standard, they're more likely to trust that you're on top of things.
It's like a seal of approval.
Right.
Like, okay, you guys have your act together.
Taking this seriously.
You're not just winging it.
Exactly.
And it's also about building trust with clients.
Absolutely.
Right. They want to know that their data is safe, that you're operating ethically,
Right.
that you're prepared for potential disruptions.
And ISO 31000 helps you demonstrate that.
Okay, so external stakeholders, but what about internal stakeholders? What about employees?
Yeah, employees too.
Does it impact their confidence as well?
Absolutely.
Okay.
When employees see that their company takes risk management seriously,
Yeah.
they feel more secure and confident in their work environment.
So it creates a better work environment.
It does.
Okay. So stakeholder confidence check. What about better decision making?
Okay.
How does ISO 31000 help with that?
Well, imagine you're a compliance officer
Okay.
and you're facing a difficult decision,
Happens all the time.
right?
There's pressure from sales to expedite a new product launch.
Right.
But you have some concerns about potential regulatory hurdles.
Yeah.
Instead of relying on your gut feeling or caving to that pressure,
You're right.
you can use the ISO 31000 framework to systematically analyze the risks and benefits.
Yeah.
So it gives you a structure,
It does.
a process to follow.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that.
So you're gathering data,
Mm-hmm.
you're assessing the likelihood and impact of different scenarios,
Okay.
and then you're making a decision based on evidence rather than emotion.
So it takes some of the subjectivity out of it,
It does.
and it helps you to be more objective in your decision making.
Exactly.
Okay? And I imagine that's especially important in compliance,
It is.
where one wrong move can have serious consequences.
Absolutely.
So you want to make sure that you're making those decisions based on solid information.
Right. And you want to be able to justify your decisions
Okay.
if you're ever called upon to do so.
And having that framework to back you up
Exactly.
gives you that extra layer of, confidence.
It does.
Okay, so better decision-making check.
Yeah.
Now, this next one I think is really interesting and maybe the most exciting for our listener.
Okay.
Career advancement.
Yeah.
How can embracing ISO 31000 boost a compliance officer's career?
Well, in today's world, companies are looking for compliance professionals who are more than just rule followers.
Okay.
They want strategic thinkers.
Right.
They want problem solvers.
Right.
They want leaders who can proactively manage risk.
So it's about being a valuable asset to the company, not just a cost center.
Not just the Department of No.
Right, right.
You're actually adding value to the organization.
And by mastering ISO 31000,
Right.
you're demonstrating that you have those skills.
Exactly.
And that can open doors to new opportunities,
It can.
leadership roles, greater influence within the company.
Absolutely.
So it's about becoming that go-to person
Right.
for all things risk-related.
You become a thought leader,
Yeah,
someone who can anticipate challenges and guide the company toward a more secure and successful future.
I like that. And I imagine that can translate into greater job satisfaction as well.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's empowering to know that you're making a real difference
Yeah.
in protecting your company and its stakeholders.
Okay, so we've talked about the benefits,
Yeah.
but let's be realistic here.
Right.
Implementing a new framework like ISO 31000,
Right.
it can be daunting.
It can be.
It's not just like flipping a switch.
It's not a quick fix.
Right.
It takes time. It takes effort. And it takes a willingness to embrace change.
To really commit to it.
Exactly.
But it doesn't have to be overwhelming.
It doesn't.
Right. There are resources available. There are training programs.
Consultants who can help you,
Yeah.
guide you through the process.
And it's about starting small.
Absolutely.
You don't have to do everything at once.
Pick one area.
Yeah.
Focus on that area.
Like maybe your compliance team.
Yeah, your own team.
Or a high-risk area like data security. Implement the principles and the process there. Learn from that experience. And then gradually expand your efforts. So it's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly.
You don't just arrive at ISO 31000 compliance.
It's a continuous improvement process.
You're constantly working on it.
Right.
And I think that's something that's really important to remember because it can feel overwhelming.
It can.
If you think about it like, oh my gosh, we have to do all of this all at once.
Right.
But if you break it down into smaller steps and you focus on one thing at a time,
Right.
it becomes much more manageable.
Exactly.
And I think it also makes it more likely that you'll actually succeed
I agree.
because you're not trying to bite off more than you can chew.
Right.
You're taking it one step at a time.
You're building momentum as you go.
And you're learning as you go,
Exactly.
which is, I think, the most important part.
It is.
Okay, so I think we've given our listener a lot to think about here.
I think so. A lot to digest.
A lot to digest.
But hopefully it's been helpful.
Oh, yeah, I think so. And hopefully it's given them some ideas
Yeah.
about how they can actually start to implement ISO 31000 in their own organizations.
And how they can use it to benefit their careers.
Exactly, and to make their companies more successful.
Right.
So before we wrap up,
Yeah.
I want to highlight one more thing.
Okay.
ISO 31000 is not a magic bullet.
It's not.
It's a framework.
Right.
It's a set of tools.
It's a way of thinking.
And its effectiveness really depends on how well it's implemented
Absolutely.
and how well it's integrated into the organizational culture.
It's not just something you can buy off the shelf and plug in.
Right. It's not a software program.
It's not.
It's something that you have to really work at.
You have to make it your own.
And it's about you, the listener, taking ownership of this process
Exactly.
and making it work for you.
That's where the real magic happens.
I like that. Okay, so that's it for this part of our deep dives into ISO 31000.
Okay.
In the next part, we're going to talk about some specific examples
Right.
of how compliance officers can actually use this framework
Sounds good.
to address some of the challenges that they're facing in their day-to-day work.
I'm looking forward to it.
So stay tuned. You know, what's interesting as we're talking about all this, it really strikes me that ISO 31000 is about so much more than just checking boxes or, avoiding fines.
It is. It really is more about building a culture of awareness and responsibility throughout the organization.
Yeah, and empowering people to identify and address risks before they become major problems.
Absolutely. And, that shift in mindset, that proactive approach, that's really what sets a compliance officer apart.
Especially in today's job market.
Absolutely.
Companies are looking for people who can think strategically, not just follow the rule book.
Exactly. They want problem solvers. They want leaders.
So it's not just about doing your job well. It's about showcasing your ability to think ahead, anticipate challenges, and be a true leader in the organization.
And ISO 31000 can really help you do that.
By giving you that framework, that process to follow.
Right. It gives you the tools and the language to talk about risk in a way that resonates with senior management.
And that can translate into, greater influence within the company.
Absolutely.
More opportunities for advancement.
And ultimately a more successful career.
It's about becoming that trusted advisor, that go-to person for all things risk-related.
Exactly.
So for our listener out there, if you're looking for a way to make a real impact, to advance your career, and to really be a leader in your organization, diving deep into ISO 31000 is a great place to start.
I couldn't agree more.
We've covered a lot of ground today,
We have.
from the core principles and framework to practical applications and career-boosting benefits.
It's been a great conversation.
But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listener with one final thought.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Think about the specific challenges that you're facing in your own compliance work.
Yeah, the things that keep you up at night.
Exactly. The headaches, the roadblocks, the things that just make you want to pull your hair out.
I know the feeling.
Now imagine approaching those challenges with the tools and the mindset of ISO 31000.
It's a game changer.
How would it change your approach? How would it empower you to be a more effective and strategic compliance officer?
That's the question I want our listener to really think about.
It's about taking this knowledge and applying it to your own unique situation
Turning theory into practice.
and making a real difference in your organization.
That's what it's all about.
So to our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into ISO 31000.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found it insightful, empowering, and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
And remember, risk is an inherent part of business.
It's not going away.
But with the right knowledge and tools
You can turn risk into an opportunity.
for growth, for innovation, and for success.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep diving deep.